Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is, let's see, we're into April now. Would this be the 3rd?
April 3rd.
In 2016. And as always, this is a program of environmentalism and stuff in general that's going around Champaign-Urbana.
So it's windy outside. It's typical March weather, but yesterday I was almost blown off my feet. And dumpster was wandering around the road, and it's still windy this morning. Certainly not the time when you would light a prairie fire. You have to remember that it's coming to spring, so people get interested in planting plants and the like, but the old rule is don't plant your tomato plants till May 1st, because there will still be some frosts or potentials, even though the world is warming up. A friend left town this week. It was Clone. He's been well known in the community. He's a baker, so often if you went to see him, he was covered in flour. But he was also a photographer, a naturalist. I have a front page to a journal that is a Leater spike that was photographed by Clone. And he's retired now, and he's headed for to be with his siblings in Oregon. He's bought a little house there, and I saw him at the Grand Prairie Friends spring meeting, and then he called me again later, and he has been a party to a lot of environmental workshops and projects around. He lives on East Main Street near to Weaver Prairie, and he's very aware of that. And it's a fairly new reconstruction prairie with a little bit of ancient trees on the one corner. So it's not easy to transit from a place where you've been for a long time to a different territory, but it can also be very exciting. So we wish Clone well and hope he finds natural history things to do out west. From a WEF point of view, Clone was a very good friend of Peter Reynolds, who was one of the early proponents of the Grateful Dead on the WEF program Saturday night, and so there's some overlap there. Peter was here fairly regularly for a long time. He'd almost finished a PhD in mathematics, and so there was an intellectual bond between various people here at that time. So I want to say something about seeding prairies. We've said it before, but it deserves to be repeated because we're going into a phase one of a construction of the railroad bed between Urbana and St. Joe. The 25 miles in the long run will be known as the Kickapoo Trail at the moment. We're working with 6 miles, and I say we, it's a project that has been a community effort, and it will be community owned by the Champaign Forest Preserve District, and the Vermilion County Conservation District will own that portion which is in Vermilion County. But this is all in Champaign County, and the Forest Reserve is the in perpetuity owner and steward of the area, but in effect it belongs to all of us, and it behooves us to be aware of its dimensions, its advantages. Heartland Pathways took out an interim trail agreement to preserve the rail bed for railroading, the trail to help preserve the railroad bed, and for the prairie that's on the right-of-way on either side of the ballast. So we've talked about the bid process. The bid process came in fairly high at $2 million for the development of 6 to 7 miles into St. Joe. You have to realize that that includes bridges and other structures. It was about $400,000 higher than expected. Cross Construction will be the low bid construction agent, and that will involve a 10-foot trail plus 2 feet on either side of gravel, which takes about 12 feet, which leaves very little for prairie preservation, which we're fairly jealous of because there is so little left. It's always very tempting in the spring to plant seed to get things rolling, but that's not always appropriate. In the case of prairie, it grows very slowly, so it's always in competition in the early years with the growth of weeds, which grow fast on soft soils, and you have to know that in order to put this trail in there, there will be construction easements, and there will be equipment on the sites that would be prairie. Let's give you a cross-section of the railroad bed. Perhaps a little history first. The Champaign County Design and Conservation Foundation, CCDC, was of the opinion that this was a very good idea, and they wanted to take over the project and did, but unfortunately didn't get the money required. The Federal Surface Transportation Board, which controls this Rail Banking Act, it gives people time to acquire money for railbed purchase, and the railbed purchase has to be local, but the federal government will provide enhancement money and save the bridges and quiet titles like in, that might distract from the contiguity of the program. That having been said, there's a limit to the time frame that you can get to pay the railroad. The three groups that are involved are the buying organization, the railroad, and the closing railroad, and surface transportation. And surface transportation gives you a permit to do this, and fortunately for us, that initial permit taken out by Heartland Pathways has continued for many years, and so after 20 years, the railroad bed, first of all, reverted to once the time frame had lifted, it reverted to railroads being able to buy the trackage, and CSX, a dominant railroad that was buying up the railroad beds in the Danville area, decided to buy that corridor, and over the 20 years they did sell to the Department of Transportation 25 feet of the railroad bed that is where we were anxious to preserve prairie. So there's very little space for prairie soil and prairie plants and remnants that were there when the railroad went through first. The road reconstruction has lifted the road up by about 2 feet, so to avoid an impoundment of water in that area. And much of the road sides to that raising is some of our best prairie soil. So the cross section is this. There's a road, it's 2 lanes wide, plus with a space on either side, and then there's a drainage ditch, and the planting on the drainage ditch will be down to the gusset, or the area of the bottom of the ditch, which is usually enough to allow water to flow. Sometimes the planting is up the other side, which makes it even more difficult to retain a little piece of prairie. But presuming we go down with plants that are mostly grasses, that are roadside grasses, then if we're in shape, then we can go up from the ditch toward the railroad bed with prairie plants. There's a difference between the traditions of the Department of Transportation and the growing interest of citizens in roadside ambiance and roadside retention of remnant prairies that are almost extinct. The Department of Transportation is responsible for the road, and it is often felt that the plants on the road can become nuclei for snowdrifts. This is especially so for roads that run north and south, where the wind blows across. So if you're on the Dewey Fisher Road from Champaign, that's going north and south, and it's subject to this sort of feeling that a few nuclei will allow the accumulation of snow. To avoid that, people who are aware that that is a reason for mowing the roadside and keeping plants on the roadside that are likely to grow quickly and dominate, then the answer to that is to mow the prairie just before winter so that there will be no nuclei available. Now, that is a problem because there's a tendency to mow early in the season, and that takes out the fruiting bodies of the prairie. So we want those people who do that sort of mowing to do it way into November or December so that they won't destroy the existing plants. That is becoming later in the year as the climate changes up. But I was talking to someone yesterday who is doing that sort of mowing to make sure that they have that sort of interaction with the Department of Transportation. The other thing that is happening is that the Department of Transportation has over the years begun to realize that people enjoy the ambiance on the roadside. And that is also paralleled with a group of people that include scientists that realize that roads, which historically paralleled railroad lines, provide us with some of the only remnant prairies that we have. So there is, in the nature community, a drive to reduce the mowing. So if we can have a balance there, that's good. And that happens in many cases. The Department of Transportation is quite generous in giving the public a chance to talk about this, and we hope that you will be aware of this and also talk about it as prairies restored on roadsides that are often widened into railroad beds. So we're talking about a specific situation between Urbana and St. Joe, but it is a generalization that this is a principle for other places. So here we have a demonstration or a prototype that we can use, and we hope that you will become aware of what is being done there and perhaps contribute to it. One of the ways that you can contribute to it is by collecting seed. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But let me give you this profile across the road, which is Highway 150, which is well trafficked. We also have a group of citizens that have grown up with neatness and tidiness, and for them, the ambiance that they want to see as they're driving to St. Joe is a clean and tidy mown roadside. And prairie is a natural ecology, and it's not going to confine itself to a neat and tidy roadside. It's more a natural ambiance, and you can't tell. One species will take over a little bit here and other species there. So we're also educating the public to realize that if you're going to have an ambiance of nature, it's going to be a little rambunctious and a little different. You can help that by putting up signs that explain what is going on. And back to this profile, you have a road, and then you have a ditch that may go down 4 feet with a little gusset in the middle, and then up toward the railroad bed. But you have to know that in this 6 miles, the road has been widened into that area, so there's very little left between the low spot and the slope up towards the railroad bed. And you have to know that the bed itself is 10 feet wide, which is really wide for a bicycle trail. It's like a highway adjacent to a highway. And there's just a few feet there, and so we're fairly jealous of the soil that's there. Once you get to the railroad ballast, there's rock and rubble that has been put in there and railroad activity, which means that it's no longer natural soil. But every inch of our prairie soil has millions and millions of bacteria and fungi that help to break down the litter that is accumulated. That is sort of aided by lightning strikes that will burn the litter, and if the lightning is not around, and if we want to control burn, we burn that litter and keep the soil intact. When that ditch is dug, unfortunately, the procedure for the Department of Transportation is to allow the contractor to bulldoze the corridor totally and to remodel the soil. That's very different from putting a hi-ho on the side of the road and lifting out the soil you need to lift out to make the ditch deeper or differently modeled. That means that the soil is disturbed, whereas if you did the reverse, a hi-ho with a scoop that took the soil out where necessary, if it's only 2 inches, then take 2 inches and the roots, the deep-rooted prairie plants will grow back. But that process is costly, and it's much easier to bulldoze the site and remodel the soil. That means you often lose some of those deep-rooted plants, perennial plants, and they get chopped up, and if you're lucky, they'll come back. But they also need to get water, and when they're exposed like that, they often die. So we will be replanting. We, in inverted commas, is basically the Forest Preserve and the contract that it has with the Department of Transportation, getting money from the Rail Banking Act. And remember that this rail bed is still available for railroaders if they need it in the future. It's likely they won't need it in any immediate future because these railroads that are being preserved are often in rural settings where there's not a lot of population. So you can look at Chicago, St. Louis, Bloomington with a possibility of extension of rail bed to Danville or to Indianapolis. So the structure is there, but it's not likely to happen for many years. So any trail that goes in will be there for a long, long time. And that time can expire. If it expires quickly, the railroad coming in will be expected to buy back the rail bed and to compensate the trail people for any use that they do not have of the rail bed. But if they've had it for 100 years, then there's an amortization rule that says you've had a reasonable use for this money that you put to the trail, and so we'll pay you something, but not as much as if we close it out 3 years after you put in a trail at considerable expense. Not likely to happen, but that's the whole reason for the Rail Banking Act, and 80% of the funds for this construction are coming from the federal government via surface transportation, STB in vernacular, but it is the federal transportation. That money goes to the state transportation and then to natural history and to hiking and biking people. So 80% federal money, 10% local money, and 10% state money. And it's costly, we know, but there are several reasons why it's also valuable to us. One very good reason is that at the end of it is a Kickapoo State Park, so that you have added value of location. You're dropping into a state park that already has facilities and is an attractive place for people to visit. So, but also you have a rail bed preserved, you have a trail, and you have the prairie. So there's 3 different things there that you're buying with this money. And it would seem that the public is very enamored with the idea of this trail, which will join various little communities and provide an opportunity for history on either side, like the Lincoln Trail parallels this railroad bed. And so the people who are supportive of this have guaranteed to get the extra $400,000 to make this construction possible. The construction will start in May and continue for approximately a year. So it won't be open for traffic for quite a while, and this is only one phase, 7 miles of a total of 25 miles. And at the other end, there are some structures like a huge bridge that will require special attention. So, and there's also the concept that you have to go over or under or somehow circumvent a major Union Pacific line that runs east of St. Joe. So this is phase one, and it will be useful in the future. But we want you to keep your eyes open and ask questions and work with it. So looking at how we plant this, you have a couple of ways of doing it. One fairly easy way to do it is to gather seed and distribute it in wintertime so that the seed will get a start in the spring. It'll perhaps germinate early and get some roots. That also is something that's easy to do if you have a hydroseeder. A hydroseeder is like putting seed in your mouth and spewing it out over the rough terrain. The Department of Transportation has agreed to have volunteers pick seed and put it into the hydroseeder, or perhaps if the soil is, the terrain is flat enough, you can use a prairie seeder. And those prairie seeders, like a normal drill, but instead of having a cup which drops seeds of corn or soybeans, the fluffy, a rather different seed of the prairie has to be stirred fairly constantly so you don't have all the little seed in one place. And it has a wheel that forces the fluffy seed down into a dropper, and instead of the dropper being 3/4 of an inch wide, it is about 2 inches wide and allows that seed to drop into the ground. A little trough is made for the seed to fall into, and then wheels, compression wheels, come along behind and cover that seed. And that's a fairly common way of seeding a pasture, but it's not an easy one for roadsides. So roadside people often use a hydroseeder, a big tank full of seeds mixed up with mulch, and often with a dye so that you can see where you have spread your seed, so you don't put too much seed in one place and not enough in another. So the seeder can sit on the roadside and spray. The question then is, what seed? The roadside seed, edge seed, is specialized to be mown, and it will be brome grass and fescues and possibly, if you have a nice agreement with the Department of Transportation, the species will be species that are mild-mannered and not aggressive enough to go into the prairie. That seed is gathered up from seed providers, and this trail has engineers which create the trail, but then the Forest Preserve has a Farnsworth group which supervises the trail. At this time, people are putting together seed mixtures, and we'd like to know that those seed mixtures, where they come from and what they are, because just a specification in a Department of Transportation guidebook may not be enough. Some of the seed may, if it comes from New Jersey and Oregon, then that gene pool is not quite what we would like. Even if it's the seed that's on the roadside, we'd like it to be somewhat Midwest. So that means that people like the Farnsworth group need to be on top of where the seed is coming from. So the planting of that seed on the roadside may even be done now. It usually comes with fertilizer and a regular drill, and once it is installed, there's usually a mulch or hay put along, and disc plows which have a disc that runs around and it's scalloped, and it puts the hay into the soil and provides a bed for that won't erode so easily. You can see the little pieces of hay sticking up. That site can also be watered. The fertilizer will allow it to grow quickly, so there's some instant gratification, and it will grow quickly, probably in 10 days. If the area has been allowed to fallow, and we can encourage that, it waits for a while, has an erosion potential, and but it allows the weeds to grow, and so that you can then mow out the weeds and then plant. And a drill similar to the prairie drill is not necessary, because the seeds that are the grass seeds used are going to drop down a normal drill. The time of planting is important, because in this case, the landscapers of the roadside are likely to have planted in the fall, so that some roots will get into action before the winter and have a display of reasonable grass surface in the spring. The area of the downslope of that cross section is fairly steep and somewhat narrow, so we would suggest that in the future it be mown by a smaller mower, not a huge batwing mower that will go not only down the slope to the drain but up the other side, because the tractor drivers don't want to confine themselves or have their tractor batwings flowing over onto the roadside. So a smaller tractor is good. We also hope that the seed that comes will not be including a native or a natural fertilizer provided with the legumes. And one of the legumes that's used a lot is sweet clover. And even though it may not be in the seed mix designated, invariably this particular seed finds its way into the roadsides, and it is tremendously invasive of the prairie that's nearby, and very costly to get rid of. It was a successful hay crop. It can be mown 7 times a year, and it is a legume, so it does convert nitrogen into nutriments that can be used by the seed on the roadside. But we seriously hope that we don't have that sort of invasive plant. The fertilizer is okay for these species. They're used to it, they like it, and that's okay. But when you get to the prairie side, no fertilizer. No fertilizer. It is going to allow the weeds to grow, and presumably we won't have the area mown so often as the roadside edge, and we just don't want the weeds. With the prairie, you may have dipsy-doodled in the seed by winter time or any other time, but you also have to know that if you want the prairie to grow quickly, you may have to treat certain seeds with striation or with, like New Jersey tea, you have to put hot water onto it to loosen up the tannins and let the seed grow. This is a natural mechanism that the seed has to allow it to grow this year, next year sometime, and it's a natural mechanism, but we are abbreviating the time that's needed for restoration by allowing it to grow quickly, and so doing that sort of treatment helps. We can also, some seed will grow much better if you vernalize. You put it in a refrigerator and let it be cold and perhaps it warm and then perhaps cold, and stratify it. That's another technique. So the seed that's going to go in there has to be treated some. So when people collect seed, you can collect it as a mixed seed, or you can collect it specifically so that you can modify the treatment or apply the treatment. That means that you may want to have a seed mill that lets you impound on the seeds and crack them open without destroying them. And the Forest Preserve has one of those machines. If you have volunteers to harvest seed in one particular month, like say September, you will end up with a September prairie. So be careful to balance your input. The south side of the railroad line is not being invaded by construction, so it's a little broader, and it is in many cases fairly native. Over 20 years since this project started, the trees have taken over some of that prairie, but we find that often those trees, once removed, will liberate the prairie that's underneath. So we don't have to do as much with the south side of 150 as with the north side. You can also transplant into this. We have a nice little prairie at Allerton Park, which is 1 mile long by 66 feet, and it included a lot of plants that will come from a prairie nursery at Mason City. And that in that case, what happened was they seeded lightly, not too much grasses, but lightly seeded the 4 or 5, 6 grasses, and then they transplanted into that prairie probably about 1,000 species, about 12 different varieties, and after about 5 or 7 years, that prairie is now looking like a prairie. It's nothing like a remnant prairie that's on the railroad bed nearby, but it's enough to encourage snakes and other small mammals and birds and butterflies that we want to encourage. So you can have your seed, pick it, modify it, or apply a treatment to it, and then that's available to go into a hydroseeder tank. In many cases, the seed is augmented by a Department of Transportation mix. Then at this time of the year, you need to find out where that mix is coming from. When you have a low bid for construction, you also have a low bid for the type of seed. So cheap seed comes from further west, where a combined harvester can be used to harvest a seed. If you're going to go with local seed, it's almost invariably hand-picked, and it's expensive. So you have to watch what goes into that hydroseeder. If you see a label that says Kansas seed, then you need to reject that. That's where we're asking the Farnsworth Group to be very careful at this time to know what seed the Department of Transportation might provide and how that will be accepting local seed too. Then there is also a time of the year to plant. If you dipsy doodle seed or broadcast it, you probably do it in winter so the seed sort of gets warm, it's nice and brown, and it can drop down into the soil and get a root or two. If you're planting with a planter or with a hydroseeder, you hope that the seed will be planted after the weeds have grown. So you let the area fallow, or you let the weeds grow until about May, when most of them are beginning to look like they're going to seed. That's the time when you mow it. Then once you've mown it, you plant your seed, and the weeds are not going to sprout again. So onward, the slow-growing prairie seed will get a chance to grow. And you hope that you've put the seed in soon enough so that there's rainfall going to provide water for germination. If there's no rainfall, then the seed will shrivel and stay there for another year until it gets rain. If necessary, you get a 1,000-gallon water tank and you water the area. But you plant the plant in the late spring to avoid the weed competition. And you do it without fertilizer. And if the soil is disturbed, which is often the case along roadsides, then you need to roll it, which is not easy if the terrain is not suitable. So you may have to avoid that. But open spaces where a roller can go can firm the soil, and the prairie seed can handle firm soil, whereas the weed seeds cannot. They like it soft and fertile, and we're avoiding the fertilizer. So if it comes, and sometimes it comes with the contract, then give it to somebody else that can use the fertilizer. Just do not put the fertilizer in with the prairie plants. All you do is increase the weeds. Now, that is not going to grow very fast. Some of the plants will grow fairly quickly in a year, but many of them will take 5, 10 years to grow and look like a prairie. So in the interim, you have to explain to the public that this is a prairie risk construction. So signs are necessary, and that's helpful to the people who are used to seeing roadsides mown. We will be saving the roadside people some trauma and having to mow regularly because it's costly, and it's costly of equipment, costly of energy, costly of labor. And so we think that the prairie restoration not only provides ambiance in a 20-year period, but it preserves the genetic gene pool, which helps scientists to retain the genetics. And the public is encouraged to understand this process, and so that's why I'm talking about it now. We're not always certain of what is happening, but that's the sort of process that you're hoping that the Farnsworth Group will be watching, and behind that is the Forest Preserve, which is quite aware of prairie elements and able to make suggestions as to what they want and what the Department of Transportation wants and what the Department of Natural Resources wants, and how all these people get together. So we thank you for listening to that one. Going on, I want to say something about the model train event, which is at Lincoln Square today. So for young people especially, there are model train setups that are quite interesting and quite modern. Some of the trains are the sort of train that never disconvolvulates. It is an intermodal train that you put semi-trailers or shipping crates onto with a gantry crane. So there are the models. And a lot of the railroad buffs are railroad-associated people. Some of them are railroad employees and retirees. So we're there because we have a 5-year-old Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad, where we would like to use 3 miles of active rail bed between Seymour and Bonneville to eventually allow us to re-rail 4 miles of our Heartland Pathways rail bed, so that eventually you could get historic railroad trains into Champaign. There's also a question in the background that the Norfolk Southern, which is used as the outlet for the Railroad Museum to escape onto a railroad line to take a steam engine to Indianapolis, or a functional tourist group to Decatur. That line may be in question if Norfolk Southern wants to retire 1,000 miles of railroad bed. We're sitting around in the background hoping that some of that, if it does get retired, could become interim trail use, which means that the rail bed could come back if necessary, but it could be a trail for many years. There are also trails that go down on an old interurban line to be meant. So when we're talking about the Railroad Museum, we're talking about some of this extended value in the location, and Allerton Park and Clinton, extending to Champaign, extends to a population of people which is much larger than Monticello and Bement, and it would provide an escape for rail interaction if necessary. So we have a booth there. The Scott family especially is big in this. They're railroad engineers and have a lot of knowledge of railroads, and we're looking for members that might be interested in preserving this 3 mile of bed between Seymour and Bonneville. If we don't get that as active bed, then we will not be reconstituting the rail between Whiteheath, where the Railroad Museum ends, and Seymour. So this has a lot of political clout to us, so we're talking to people. And in the process, it's wonderful to experience other groups. There's the Railroad Museum itself has an exhibit, and then it has a fun little railroad that's probably got a 12-inch rail line, and it's a circle, and the kids get in these little trolleys, and they have a winder like a bicycle pedaling with your hands to move along this railroad trackage, and gentlemen in the background making sure that everything works. And that's very popular for young people. The older people are telling stories, and I'm listening to these stories. And some of it involves the equipment that you have. Early on, some of the railroad cars that were built with I-beams, with wood. And if your train crashed, if a fire took out a culvert and the train crashed, then all that the wood splintered and it wasn't very friendly. Gradually, you've got different systems. Some of those systems have old buffers that used to come together, whereas the American train now hooks with a specialized hook rather than with buffers. And you notice some of these things. So one of the stories I was listening to was that a wheel, the rim of the wheel collapsed. You have to know that the steel that goes into railroad lines and to the equipment that's on the rails is limited by the research that's been done for the metal that's there, for the little aberrations that are in it. And sometimes you can get a wheel that goes flat because there's an aberration at one point. That wheel can actually skid along the line, and that can destroy the railroad bed itself. But if you have a wheel, and University of Illinois used to have a wheel lab that tested wheels that were going for a long time. How long do you have a wheel on the ground? How responsible is it? What is a new method of doing it? What steels will you make? What axles will you use? How will the axles spread across the rail bed? How will you know if a journal is jammed and it is a hot journal? So if you have a train, then there are boxes here and there where the train can be supervised independently for hot boxes. So if you have a wheel that sheds its rim, then that can be a catastrophe and can be dragged on without the driver knowing that it's happening. So thus the need for hot boxes that record this, record the temperature. Other stories include the likes of a train derailing at one point and then encountering a road crossing and jumping up and getting back on the rail and re-railing again. And so I've been listing some interesting stories here. Okay, you can visit the Lincoln Square today till 4 o'clock to go to the model train show and be interested in the people that you meet and who are interested. We're hoping that some of you may be interested in membership of the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad Bed, and we're hoping to work with the elevators to make sure that 3 mile of rail bed remains, and that we will in turn be able to re-rail 4 miles of railroad bed between the Railroad Museum and Seymour. So I think that's about all we have time for. So, but it's nice weather. Get out there and poke your nose into Lincoln Square. This has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. I will note that at Dave's request, the music that you're listening to right now is not the usual Joel Mabus solo banjo piece. At the end of Dave's notes, he says, exit with an early Grateful Dead piece. I would not be an appropriate producer for this program if I didn't follow that request. So
that's because Clone and Peter Reynolds were friends, and Clone has moved out of town and we'll miss him. And Peter has unfortunately passed on, but he for a long time was the air shifter for the Grateful Dead.
And I will first of all mention, as always, that the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and nobody else.